How to be happy alone. Here is a question that nobody really wants to answer honestly. When was the last time you sat in a completely quiet room, no phone, no music, no noise, and actually felt okay? Not anxious, not restless, not reaching for something to distract yourself, just okay. Most people cannot even remember. And that silence right there, that discomfort that creeps in the moment everything goes quiet, that is worth paying attention to. Here is another one. Why is it so easy to feel lonely in a room full of people, but so hard to feel peaceful when you are finally alone? Think about that for a second. People spend their whole lives chasing connection, chasing noise, chasing something to fill the space. But the moment they get what they wanted, silence, rest, time alone, they panic. Something feels wrong. But nothing is wrong. They just never learned how to sit with themselves. There was a monk in a small temple in Japan. He lived alone for 3 years. No visitors, no phone, no conversations. And when a journalist finally came to ask him if he ever felt lonely, the monk smiled and said something strange. He said, "I am never alone. I always have myself." The journalist did not understand that answer then, but by the end of this video, that answer is going to make complete sense. Welcome to Wisdom Woven, the place where ancient wisdom meets the life you're actually living right now. If this is the first time here, take a moment, hit that subscribe button, and join a community of people who are choosing to think deeper and live better. If this video speaks to something real inside of you, leave a comment below. Tell the world what being alone feels like for you. That one comment might help someone else feel less alone tonight. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and let the journey begin. Now here is what nobody tells people about being alone. It is not the problem. It was never the problem. The problem is that people were never taught how to do it. From childhood, silence was punished. Empty time was called laziness. Sitting alone was called antisocial. So people grew up terrified of their own company without ever understanding why. Buddhism has known this for over 2,000 years. The Buddha himself walked away from his kingdom, his wife, his child, his entire comfortable life, and sat alone under a tree. Not because he was depressed, not because he was running away, but because he understood something that most people are only beginning to realize today, that everything a human being is searching for outside, peace, joy, clarity, is already sitting quietly somewhere inside. But here's where it gets interesting. Buddhism does not teach people to become cold or detached from the world. It does not say that love and friendship are bad. What it actually says is far more subtle than that. It says that when a person cannot be at peace alone, they will never truly be at peace with others either, because whatever is broken inside does not get fixed by adding more people around it. Think about how modern life is designed. Every single second is filled with something. Notifications, conversations, content, noise. People are the most connected generation in human history and somehow also the loneliest. That is not a coincidence. That is a symptom. And the cure is not more connection. The cure is learning what to do in the quiet. There's a Pali word in Buddhism called viveka. It doesn't translate perfectly into English, but the closest meaning is a kind of joyful solitude. Not sad aloneness, not isolation, but a deliberate, chosen, peaceful being with oneself. The ancient monks considered this not a sacrifice, but a gift, a rare and precious thing that very few people ever give themselves. The difference between loneliness and solitude is not about how many people are in the room. It is entirely about the relationship a person has with their own mind. A lonely person can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel invisible. A person rooted in solitude can sit in an empty room and feel completely whole. That gap between those two experiences is exactly what this video is going to close. Most people treat being alone like a waiting room, something temporary to survive until the real life starts again, until the next call, the next plan, the next distraction arrives. But what if being alone was not the waiting room? What if it was actually the destination?
What if the version of life that feels most real and most alive was the one happening in the quiet moments nobody else gets to see? Buddhism teaches something called Atta Dipa. It's a phrase the Buddha used in his very last teaching before he died. It means, be a lamp unto yourself, not a lamp for others to see you, a lamp for you to see yourself. And a person cannot see themselves clearly when they are constantly looking outward, constantly looking for someone else to tell them who they are.
Here is something true that is rarely said out loud. Most people are not afraid of being alone. They are afraid of what they will find when the noise stops. The thoughts they have been avoiding, the feelings they buried under busyness, the questions they never answered because answering them felt too heavy. And so the noise becomes armor, constant, comforting, exhausting armor. But Buddhism says those avoided thoughts are not the enemy, they are invitations. Every uncomfortable feeling that rises in the silence is not a sign that something is wrong, it is a sign that something needs to be seen. And the moment a person is willing to sit with what they find instead of running from it, something extraordinary begins to happen. The fear starts to shrink. The irony is this. People work so hard to build a life full of things and people and experiences, all to feel less alone. But the loneliest version of any person is the one who cannot tolerate 5 minutes of silence with themselves. And the most deeply content person in any room is usually the one who needed nothing from that room to begin with. This is not a video about becoming a monk. Nobody is suggesting sitting under a tree for 6 years or giving up relationships or moving into a cave in the mountains. This is about something far simpler and far more urgent, learning how to exist in your own presence without it feeling like a punishment, learning how to be with yourself the way you would want someone else to be with you. Buddhism breaks this down into something very practical. It starts with understanding why the mind resists stillness in the first place. Because the mind has a very specific job, and that job is not to make a person happy. The mind's job is to keep a person safe, to scan for problems, to plan, to worry. And when there is nothing external to focus on, it turns that same restless energy inward, and that is when things get uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a flaw in the system. It is just the mind doing what it was trained to do. And just like any habit, it can be retrained, not by force, not by fighting the thoughts, but by doing something the mind has never been taught, by simply watching, by observing without reacting, by sitting in the storm without trying to stop it. That is the beginning of what Buddhists call awareness, and awareness changes everything. Over the next parts of this video, every piece of this is going to be broken down step by step. Why solitude is not the enemy, how the mind creates the illusion of loneliness, what Buddhist monks actually do when the silence gets heavy, and the simple but radical shift in thinking that turns being alone from something to survive into something to treasure. This is not theory. Every single part of this has been practiced and lived for thousands of years. Before moving forward, take one breath. Just one slow, deliberate breath. Because what comes next is going to ask something of the mind that it has never been asked before. It is going to ask it to stop running. And the strange thing is, once it stops, what it finds waiting is not emptiness, it is everything it was running toward all along. Most people think they understand what it means to be alone. They have been alone before. They have sat in quiet rooms. They have spent evenings without anyone around. But understanding solitude and actually experiencing it are two completely different things. One is just an absence of people. The other is a presence of something far deeper. And Buddhism has been pointing at that difference for centuries, while the rest of the world kept looking the other way. There is a story about a young student who came to a Zen master and said he wanted to find inner peace. The master poured him a cup of tea and kept pouring even after the cup was full. Tea spilled everywhere. The student watched in confusion and finally said, "Stop, the cup is full." The master looked at him and said, "Exactly. How can anything new enter what is already overflowing?" That student was not carrying a cup of tea. He was carrying a mind so full of noise, opinion, worry, and memory that peace had absolutely nowhere to land. That is the condition most people are walking around in right now. Not because they are broken, not because they are weak, but because nobody ever taught them to empty the cup. Solitude is not about removing people from life. It is about creating enough inner space that life can actually be felt, rather than just endured. And Buddhism treats that inner space not as a luxury, but as a necessity, like water, like air, something without which the soul quietly suffocates. The Buddha made a distinction that very few people talk about today. He separated two types of aloneness. The first is the aloneness that comes from disconnection, from feeling unseen, from reaching out and finding nothing there. That kind of aloneness is painful. It is the kind that keeps people awake at 3 in the morning, staring at a ceiling. The second kind is something entirely different. It is the aloneness that comes from being so fully present with oneself that nothing outside feels necessary to complete the moment. Buddhism calls that the higher solitude, and it is not something that happens by accident. Here is what makes this harder than it sounds. The world is not designed for solitude. Every product, every platform, every notification is engineered to pull attention outward, to make a person believe that something important is always happening somewhere else, that to look inward is to miss out. And after years of living inside that system, the mind genuinely forgets how to turn around. It becomes so accustomed to looking outward that the very idea of sitting still feels like deprivation rather than freedom. Buddhism calls this attachment to distraction, and it is considered one of the most subtle forms of suffering. Not because distraction is evil, but because it keeps a person permanently on the surface of their own life, always busy, always connected, always moving, but never actually arriving anywhere, never settling into the one place where everything real about a human being actually lives, which is inward, quietly, beneath all the noise. There was a period in the Buddha's life before he reached enlightenment when he tried everything the world said would bring peace. He had wealth, he had beauty, he had pleasure, he had relationships, and none of it held. Not because those things are bad, but because he was looking for something permanent in things that were never designed to last. And the moment he turned inward, really turned inward, everything changed. Not instantly, not dramatically, but the direction changed, and direction is everything. Solitude in Buddhism is not passive. That is the part that surprises most people. It is not about zoning out or going blank or escaping the mind. It's actually one of the most active things a human being can do. Because when a person sits alone in genuine stillness, the mind does not go quiet automatically. It gets louder first. Thoughts come rushing in, old memories surface, emotions that were buried show up uninvited. And the work is not to push them away. The work is to stay, to keep sitting, to keep breathing, to refuse to run. Buddhist monks describe the first weeks of serious solitude practice as uncomfortable in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has never tried it. The mind fights, it bargains, it creates urgency where there is none. It throws up reasons to stand up, to reach for the phone, to do something, anything other than sit there. And this is actually the most important moment, because what is fighting is not the person, what is fighting is the habit, the deeply conditioned reflex to escape, and habits can be changed. There is a teaching in Theravada Buddhism that speaks of upekkha. It is often translated as equanimity, but that word does not quite capture it either. It is closer to a settled unshakability, a quality of being where the person is no longer at the mercy of whatever is happening around them, where the noise can rise and fall and the person inside remains steady, not cold, not indifferent, just rooted, like a tree that bends in a storm but whose roots go deep enough that it never falls. That quality does not come from having perfect circumstances. It does not come from having no problems or no pain or no difficult relationships. It comes from spending enough time alone with the self that the self becomes familiar territory. When a person knows their own mind well enough, nothing the mind throws up can shock them anymore. They have seen it all before.
They have sat with the fear before. They have let the sadness move through before, and they know by now that it always, eventually passes. Here is a truth that sounds strange until it lands properly. Buddhism teaches that the version of a person that other people see is mostly performance. Not dishonest performance, just the layer that has learned how to exist in social spaces. But alone, without an audience, without the need to manage impressions, something else shows up. The actual person, the one underneath the role. And most people have spent so little time with that person that they find them almost foreign, almost uncomfortable, like meeting someone for the first time who has known them their whole life.
This is why so many people feel a vague sense of not knowing who they really are. It is not because they are complicated, it is because they have never been alone long enough to find out. Every answer they have ever given about themselves has been shaped by who was in the room asking the question, by what was expected, by what felt safe. Solitude strips all of that away, and what is left is not nothing. What is left is the truth. And the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is always a relief. Buddhism does not say that the self discovered in solitude is perfect. It does not say that sitting alone will reveal a flawless, enlightened being underneath all the noise. What it says is far more honest and far more useful. It says that what is found is real, and real can be worked with. Real can be understood. Real can be slowly, gently transformed. But the performance that most people present to the world, even to themselves, cannot be transformed because it is not actually there. It is just a mask, and masks have no feelings to heal. There is something quietly beautiful about what happens to a person who genuinely befriends their own solitude over time. They stop needing validation in the same frantic way, not because they become arrogant, but because they no longer have a hole that needs filling. When a person has sat alone long enough to know their own worth, not as a concept but as an experience, the approval of others becomes something they can enjoy without depending on. That is a kind of freedom most people spend their entire lives searching for in the wrong direction. Buddhism points to the moon, but it always reminds people not to stare at the finger, meaning the teachings, the practices, the stories, the wisdom, none of it is the destination. It is all pointing at something that words cannot fully contain. And that something is the direct experience of one's own awareness. Not thinking about awareness, not reading about awareness, but actually sitting inside it, feeling it, knowing it from the inside. And that experience is only available in one place, in the quiet, alone. The world teaches people to fear their own emptiness, to fill every gap with something, to treat silence like a problem to be solved. But Buddhism teaches that the emptiness is not empty at all, that what feels like nothing when the noise finally stops is actually something vast, something the mind cannot measure because it is larger than the mind itself. And the only way to begin to know that vastness is to stop running from it long enough to let it show itself. This is where solitude stops being a concept and starts being a practice. Because understanding all of this intellectually is one thing. Actually sitting alone tomorrow morning before the phone is touched, before the coffee is made, before the day begins and its demands arrive, and spending even 5 quiet minutes just being present with whatever is there, that is another thing entirely. That 5 minutes is worth more than 100 hours of reading about Buddhism, because it is real, it is lived, and it changes something that reading never quite reaches. There is a quiet irony worth noticing here. People search everywhere for something that requires no travel, no money, no special equipment, and no particular talent. Just stillness, just presence, just the willingness to sit with oneself without immediately wanting to be somewhere else. The monastery is useful, the mountain is beautiful, but Buddhism has always been clear that the temple is not outside. It never was. It was always here, in this body, in this breath, in this ordinary, unremarkable, completely sacred moment of being alive. So as this part closes, something worth carrying forward into the rest of this video. Solitude is not the goal. Solitude is the doorway. What is on the other side of that door is a version of life that feels genuinely inhabited rather than just passed through. A life where peace is not something chased, but something returned to, again and again, quietly, without fanfare, like breathing, like a heartbeat,
like something that was always there, waiting patiently for the noise to stop so it could finally be heard. Picture a monkey locked inside a glass box. It jumps from one wall to the other. It grabs at things it cannot hold. It screams for no reason. It gets distracted by its own reflection. It never stops moving, never stops reacting, never rests. Now, picture that monkey is not in a box. Picture it is sitting right behind the eyes, because that is exactly what the untrained human mind looks like from the inside. And most people have been living with that monkey their entire life without even realizing it has a name. Buddhism gave it a name over 2,000 years ago. Kapicita, the monkey mind. It is not an insult, it is an observation. An honest, almost uncomfortably accurate description of what happens inside the human head when nobody is paying attention. The mind swings from thought to thought the same way a monkey swings from branch to branch, not because it is going somewhere, just because swinging is what it does. And here is the part that quietly ruins everything. Most people are not aware that the monkey is running the show. They think the thoughts that appear in their head are them. They think every worry, every judgment, every spiral of anxiety is their actual self speaking, but it is not. It is just the monkey, loud, restless, and completely convinced that everything it says is urgent. There is a reason this matters more now than it ever has before. The modern world was built specifically to feed the monkey. Every notification is a branch, every scroll is a swing, every piece of content designed to grab attention is just another thing for the monkey to grab at. The world did not create the monkey mind, but it did build the perfect jungle for it to run wild in. And most people handed it the keys without asking any questions. The Buddha noticed this about the human mind long before screens existed. He sat with people who were suffering, not from poverty, not from illness, but from their own thinking. People who had everything they needed and still could not rest. And his observation was simple and devastating at the same time. He said suffering does not come from what is happening, it comes from the mind's refusal to stop commenting on what is happening. Think about the last time something mildly annoying happened. A slow driver, a rude comment, a plan that fell apart. The event itself lasted maybe 30 seconds, but the mind replayed it for hours, rewrote the conversation, imagined better responses, predicted future problems based on that one moment. That right there is the monkey, taking a 30-second experience and building an entire prison out of it. Buddhism does not ask people to get rid of the monkey. That is an important distinction that most people miss when they first hear about meditation or mindfulness. The goal is never to have an empty mind. The goal is never silence in the sense of zero thought. That is impossible, and chasing it will only make the monkey louder. The actual goal is something far more achievable. It is to stop being controlled by the monkey, to watch it without becoming it. There is a teaching from the Zen tradition that puts this very clearly. A student goes to a master and says the thoughts in his head will not stop. The master points to a river and asks the student what happens when a leaf falls into the water. The student says it floats downstream. The master nods and says exactly. The river does not chase the leaf. The river does not argue with the leaf. It simply lets it pass. Become the river, not the leaf. But here's where most people get it wrong when they first try this. They sit down, they close their eyes, a thought appears, they try to push it away. The thought gets stronger, they get frustrated, they think they are failing, then they give up, and then they say meditation does not work for them. But what actually happened is they tried to fight the monkey, and fighting the monkey is the one thing that always makes it worse. The technique that actually works is almost embarrassingly simple. It's called noting. When a thought appears, instead of following it or fighting it, a person simply labels it thinking, planning, worrying, remembering, just one word, and then they return to the breath. That's it, the whole practice. It sounds too easy to matter, but what it does inside the brain over time is profound. It creates a gap, a tiny but life-changing gap between the thought and the reaction. That gap is everything, because in that gap lives the ability to choose. Without the gap, the monkey is in charge. A thought appears and the body reacts automatically. Anger, anxiety, sadness, all of it fires instantly with no space in between. But once that gap opens up even slightly, a person stops being a passenger in their own mind. They start becoming the one holding the wheel. And that shift, that one small shift, changes the entire texture of daily life. Neuroscience has actually caught up with what Buddhism figured out thousands of years ago. When a person consistently observes their thoughts without reacting, the amygdala, the part of the brain that fires panic signals, literally begins to quiet down. The neural pathways that were carved deep by years of anxious thinking start to lose their grip. New pathways form, calmer ones, not because the problems disappeared, but because the brain learned that not every thought is an emergency.
There is a quiet irony in all of this. The mind that cannot stop thinking is the same mind that is desperately searching for peace. It is like a person tearing apart a room looking for their glasses, while the glasses are sitting on top of their head. The peace that the mind is chasing by thinking more and harder is being blocked by the thinking itself. And the moment the thinking slows, even briefly, the peace was already there. It never left. It was just buried under the noise. Buddhist monks have a practice called anapanasati. It is one of the oldest meditation techniques the Buddha ever taught. The translation is mindfulness of breathing. And before anyone thinks this sounds too simple to be powerful, consider this. It was the exact practice the Buddha himself was doing under the Bodhi tree the night he reached enlightenment. He was not doing anything complicated. He was simply watching his breath go in and go out, and refusing to be pulled away by anything else. The breath is used for a very specific reason. It is always happening. It does not require memory or planning. It exists only in the present moment. And the present moment is the one place the monkey cannot survive. The monkey lives in the past and the future. It replays old conversations and rehearses arguments that have not happened yet. But the breath is right now. This inhale, this exhale. And every time attention returns to it, the monkey loses its grip just a little more. Here is something worth sitting with. The average human has somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 thoughts in a single day. Researchers have found that the majority of those thoughts are repetitive, the same thoughts cycling through again and again. And of those repetitive thoughts, the vast majority lean negative, not because humans are broken, but because the brain evolved to look for threats. It was designed for survival, not happiness. And understanding that one fact removes an enormous amount of guilt from the equation. The monkey mind is not a personal failure. It is not a sign of weakness or mental illness or spiritual inadequacy. It is just an ancient survival system running in a world it was never designed for. The problem is not that the system exists. The problem is that nobody ever taught most people how to update it. And Buddhism is, at its core, an instruction manual for doing exactly that, written in the simplest possible language by someone who actually figured it out. There is a small but powerful exercise that anyone can try tonight. Before sleeping, sit for just 5 minutes, not to meditate in any formal sense, just to watch. Every thought that arrives, name it silently, just one word: worry, memory, plan, fantasy. Do not judge it, do not engage with it, just name it and let it pass. 5 minutes. And notice what happens to the quality of the silence in between the thoughts, because there is silence in between. There always was. It was just never noticed before. The monks who spent decades in solitude were not superhuman. They were not born with quieter minds. Many of them described their early years of practice as almost unbearable. The thoughts were relentless. The discomfort was real. But they stayed. Not because they were fearless, but because they had been told something important by those who came before them, that the noise always peaks before it breaks, that the monkey always screams loudest just before it finally sits down. The monkey will not be tamed in a day. That is not how any of this works. But every single moment of awareness, every breath returned to,
Every thought named instead of followed is a thread being pulled, and threads add up. Slowly, quietly, without drama, the noise begins to soften, not because life got easier, but because the mind got wiser, and a wiser mind is a quieter one, and a quieter mind is the beginning of something that most people spend their whole life searching for without knowing exactly what to call it. Most people are living in two places at once, and neither of those places is here. The mind is either replaying something that already happened or rehearsing something that has not happened yet, a conversation from 3 days ago, a meeting next Thursday, a mistake from last year, a fear about next month. Meanwhile, the actual moment, this one, right now, is passing completely unnoticed. And this is not a small problem. This is the central problem. Everything else is a symptom of this. Buddhism has one answer for almost every form of human suffering. It is not a mantra, it is not a ritual, it is not a complicated philosophy that takes years to understand. It is this: come back. Come back to right now. Come back to this breath, this step, this cup of tea in the hand, this single moment that is actually real. Because the past is a memory, and the future is a guess, and the only place life is actually happening is in the thin sliver of now that most people keep skipping over. There was a monk named Thich Nhat Hanh who spent decades teaching this one idea in dozens of different ways. He once said something so simple that almost sounds like nothing. He said that the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. Read that again slowly. Not with the thinking mind, with something quieter. Because that sentence is not poetry, it is a map. And most people have been walking in circles because they never stop to read it. Here is what makes this so strange. The present moment is the one thing that has always been available. It requires no money, no special skill, no perfect circumstances. It is always here, completely free, completely accessible. And yet it is the thing people are worst at inhabiting, because the mind was trained to be everywhere except here. And a mind that is always somewhere else is a mind that is always, in some quiet way, suffering. Buddhism calls this particular kind of mental wandering papanka. It is a Pali word that roughly translates to mental proliferation, the tendency of the mind to take one simple moment and spin an entire story out of it. Someone says something slightly off, and the mind builds a narrative about being disrespected. A plan falls through, and the mind constructs a theory about how everything always goes wrong. The moment was small. The story the mind built around it was enormous, and papanka is what bridges the two. The reason this matters so deeply in the context of being alone is this. When a person is alone, the mind has no external events to react to, so it starts generating its own. It manufactures problems from old memories. It invents future scenarios and then reacts to those as if they are real. It creates the sensation of chaos in a completely quiet room. And this is why people feel restless and anxious when they are alone, even when nothing is actually wrong. The mind is not responding to reality, it is responding to its own screenplay. The practice the Buddha prescribed for this is not complicated. It is called sampajana in Pali, and it means clear comprehension, being fully aware of what is actually happening in this moment as opposed to what the mind is narrating about this moment. The difference between those two things is the difference between peace and suffering, and the gap between them is smaller than most people think. It is not a gap measured in years of meditation, it is a gap measured in a single moment of honest attention. Here is a practical way to understand this. When a person washes dishes, the untrained mind is everywhere except the dishes. It is planning the evening, it is replaying a conversation, it is worrying about tomorrow. The dishes are just getting washed on autopilot while the mind is somewhere else entirely. But when the same person washes dishes with full presence, feeling the warm water, noticing the weight of each plate, hearing the small sounds of the kitchen, something shifts. The ordinary becomes rich, the mundane becomes enough. And enough is not a small thing. Enough is everything most people are chasing and never finding. Buddhism took this idea and made it the center of its entire tradition. There's a famous Zen saying that when walking, just walk. When eating, just eat. When sitting, just sit. It sounds almost absurdly simple, but living inside it is one of the most radical things a human being can attempt in a world that demands constant multitasking, constant performance, constant mental noise. To just do the one thing that is happening right now, completely, without commentary, is an act of quiet rebellion against almost everything modern life teaches. There's a reason children are often so happy in moments that adults barely notice. A child can be completely absorbed in watching a bug cross a leaf, not thinking about what comes next, not comparing the bug to other bugs they have seen, not wondering what the bug means about their future, just watching, just here, just now. And somewhere along the way of growing up, most people traded that quality of presence for the illusion that thinking more and planning more and worrying more would lead to a better life. It never does. It just leads to more thinking. Buddhism does not ask people to stop thinking. That point cannot be made enough times. The practice is not about achieving some blank, thoughtless state. The practice is about noticing when the mind has left the present and gently, without drama, without self-criticism, escorting it back. The key word there is gently, because the way most people treat themselves when their mind wanders is anything but gentle. They get frustrated, they call themselves bad at this, and that frustration is just another thought that pulled them further from now. There is a teaching from the Soto Zen school that describes meditation not as a technique for achieving something, but as the direct expression of our original nature. This is a strange idea the first time it lands, but sit with it. The idea is that presence is not something to be earned or built or practiced toward. It is the natural state of the mind before the noise arrived. Every moment of presence is not a step toward peace, it is peace itself, already here, already complete. The only thing obscuring it is the layer of mental commentary placed on top of it. Now, here is where most people who discover this idea make a very specific mistake. They try to be present all the time. They turn presence into a performance. They monitor themselves constantly, checking whether they are in the moment, which is itself a thought that takes them out of the moment. This is the trap within the trap, and it is almost funny in a quiet human sort of way. The mind is so committed to doing something that it turns even non-doing into a project. The antidote to this trap is what Buddhism calls beginner's mind, in Japanese, shoshin. It means approaching each moment as if for the first time, without conclusions, without assumptions, without the weight of everything already decided. A beginner does not have the pressure of expertise. They can simply look, simply notice, simply be curious about what is happening right now, without needing it to mean anything or lead anywhere. And that quality of freshness is available to anyone in any moment. It is not reserved for beginners. It is available to anyone willing to drop what they already know for one moment. Here is something worth considering honestly. The happiest moments most people can remember in their lives were almost certainly moments of complete presence. The first morning of a trip somewhere beautiful, a conversation that went so deep that hours passed without noticing, a piece of music that made everything else disappear, a moment holding someone and not wanting to be anywhere else. None of those moments happened in the past or the future. They happened right here, right now, and they felt so full because for once the mind agreed to stay. What Buddhism offers is the ability to access that quality of experience without needing a dramatic circumstance to trigger it, without needing a beautiful location or a perfect conversation or an extraordinary event. The depth that people feel in their peak moments is not caused by the external circumstances. The circumstances just happen to be compelling enough to pull the mind fully into the present. The practice is learning to be pulled there by choice, by training, by the quiet discipline of returning again and again to now. There is a difference between time that passes and time that is lived. Most people have experienced months that disappeared without a single memory worth keeping. And most people have also experienced a single afternoon that felt more alive than an entire year. The difference is not in the clock. The difference is entirely in how present the mind was. And this is a disturbing thought if followed to its conclusion, because it means that a life spent mentally absent is a life that will feel, at the end, like it barely happened at all. The monks who mastered this were not escaping life. They were doing something far more difficult. They were refusing to escape from it. Every moment of discomfort sat with, every moment of boredom inhabited, every moment of silence accepted without filling it. And over years of this practice, something remarkable happened. The present moment, even when it was difficult, even when it was painful, began to feel like home, because it was real. And real, even when it hurts, is far better than the comfortable fiction of a mind lost in past and future. The invitation that Buddhism extends is not complicated. It does not require a temple or a cushion or a robe or a teacher. It requires only this. The next time the mind pulls toward yesterday or tomorrow, notice it. Just notice. Do not judge it. Do not fight it. Simply see it for what it is. A habit. An old one. A deep one, but just a habit. And every habit, no matter how old, begins to loosen the moment it is seen clearly enough. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is a quiet one, but quiet transformations are the ones that actually last. And here is the thought to carry into the next part of this video. Every moment of genuine presence is a moment of genuine freedom. Not the freedom to go anywhere or do anything, but the deepest kind of freedom. The freedom from the mind's own noise. The freedom from the past that is already gone and the future that is not yet here. The freedom of this breath, this moment, this exact point in time that will never come again and is, for exactly that reason, worth everything.
There's a version of every person that nobody else ever sees. The version that exists in the quiet moments after a mistake. The version that lies awake at 3 in the morning replaying conversations and counting failures. The version that looks in the mirror and immediately starts listing what is wrong. Most people have never introduced themselves to this version. They have only punished it. And that punishment, quiet and constant and deeply familiar, is one of the heaviest things a human being carries without ever putting a name to it. Buddhism has a word for the antidote, karuna. It means compassion, but not the kind directed outward toward other people, the kind directed inward toward the self. And when most people first hear this, something in them resists, because somewhere along the way, self-compassion got confused with self-pity, or laziness, or weakness, or making excuses, and so people abandoned it entirely and replaced it with something much harsher, a voice inside that speaks in a tone they would never use with another human being, a standard applied to themselves that they would consider cruel if applied to anyone else. Here's an experiment worth trying. Think about the last time a close friend came with a problem, a failure, a moment of embarrassment, a decision they regretted. Think about the tone used to respond to them, the patience, the understanding, the instinct to reassure rather than condemn. Now think about the last time something similar happened personally. The same failure, the same embarrassment, the same regret. And notice the difference in the internal response. Because for most people, the difference is enormous. And that gap between how people treat those they love and how they treat themselves is exactly where unnecessary suffering lives. Buddhism has a word for the antidote, metta, which translates as loving kindness, are built on one foundational idea that most people skip over when they first encounter it. The traditional metta meditation does not begin with sending love outward, it begins by sending it inward. The very first object of loving kindness in this practice is the self, not as an afterthought, not as a warm-up before the real work begins, but as the starting point. Because Buddhism understood something that modern psychology is only recently confirming. A person cannot genuinely extend compassion to others beyond the degree to which they have allowed it for themselves. Think about water being poured from a vessel.
A vessel with a crack in it cannot fill another vessel. It is losing more than it is giving. And most people walking through daily life are cracked vessels, pouring energy and kindness and patience outward while the internal supply runs dry. Not because they are selfish, actually because they are the opposite of selfish, because they were taught that putting themselves last was a virtue, that self-neglect was nobility, and they believed it, and they are exhausted from believing it. There is a monk named Ajahn Chah who spent decades teaching in the forests of Thailand. He used to say something that his students found strange at first. He said that a person who cannot sit peacefully alone with themselves will never truly be able to sit peacefully with anyone else, because they will always be using other people as a mirror, looking for their own worth in someone else's eyes. And a reflection is not the same thing as a truth. A reflection changes depending on who is holding the mirror. Self-compassion is not about pretending that mistakes did not happen. It is not about lowering standards or avoiding accountability. Buddhist self-compassion is actually far more honest than harsh self-criticism, because harsh self-criticism does not lead to change. Research into this has been done extensively. What harsh self-criticism actually does is trigger the brain's threat response, the same response that fires when a person is being physically attacked. And a brain in threat response does not learn, it does not grow, it contracts, it defends, it shuts down. Real change does not happen in that state. Real change happens in safety. There's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called Tonglen. On the surface, it looks like a breathing exercise, but what it actually does inside a person over time is radical. The practice involves breathing in difficulty, pain, suffering, and breathing out relief, compassion, space, not as a metaphor, as a full-bodied felt experience. And it begins with the practitioner's own suffering, their own pain breathed in first, acknowledged first, given space first before anything else. Because what cannot be acknowledged cannot be healed, and what cannot be healed will be projected outward in ways that damage everything it touches. A person who is genuinely compassionate toward themselves does something that looks almost counterintuitive from the outside. They make decisions from a place of care rather than fear. They set boundaries not from anger, but from self-respect. They choose rest not from laziness, but from wisdom. They ask for help not from weakness, but from honesty. And they walk through their own failures, not with the heavy steps of someone being punished, but with the lighter steps as someone who is learning. Every single one of these qualities becomes available the moment self-compassion is no longer treated as a luxury, but as a foundation. There's a very old story from the Buddhist tradition about a monk who went to his teacher full of shame after making a serious mistake. He expected judgment. He expected to be told he was not worthy of continuing the practice. Instead, the teacher looked at him for a long moment and said only this: "The wound is the place where the light enters." This was not a dismissal of the mistake. It was a reframe of what the mistake meant, not evidence of worthlessness, but an opening, a crack in the armor of the constructed self. And through that crack, if the monk was willing, something real could finally come in. Self-compassion does not make a person soft. This point is worth saying clearly, because the fear of becoming soft is one of the main reasons people resist it. Research consistently shows that people who practice genuine self-compassion are actually more resilient after failure, not less. They recover faster. They learn more from their mistakes. They are more willing to try again, because they are not spending their energy on shame management. They are not using half their mental resources defending against their own inner critic. That energy is free, and free energy in a human being moves naturally toward growth. The journey of learning to be alone, genuinely alone, peacefully alone, begins and ends here, in this relationship, the one with the self. Because the quality of every experience in solitude is determined by the quality of this one relationship. A person who has made peace with themselves does not need the noise to feel okay. They do not need the constant input of other people to feel real. They carry something with them wherever they go, a quiet steadiness, an inner companionship, the kind that does not cancel plans, the kind that does not judge, the kind that stays. And once a person finds that in themselves, the word alone stops meaning what it used to mean. It stops feeling like a loss, and it starts feeling, slowly and genuinely and without any performance, like enough. There is a moment that happens to some people late at night. The house is quiet. Everyone else is asleep. The phone is face down. The noise of the day has finally settled. And in that thin, fragile window of stillness, something stirs. Not anxiety this time, not the usual restlessness, something quieter than that. Something that feels almost like recognition, like the mind briefly remembering something it forgot a long time ago. Most people do not know what to do with that feeling, so they reach for the phone. They turn the television back on. They fill the silence before it can say anything. But that feeling, that quiet stirring in the stillness, that is exactly what this entire journey has been pointing toward. 7 parts of this video have been building toward one thing. Not a technique, not a philosophy, not a set of rules to follow. One simple, radical, quietly life-changing understanding. That the peace every person is searching for is not somewhere ahead of them. It is not waiting on the other side of a better life or a fixed relationship or a resolved problem. It is here, right now, in this breath, in this moment, in the silence that was always available and was always enough. It was just never trusted, and learning to trust it is the work of a lifetime. But it begins in a single moment of choosing not to run. Buddhism did not survive for 2,500 years because it was a nice idea. It survived because it worked. Because generation after generation of ordinary human beings, not monks living in perfect conditions, but real people with real suffering and real confusion, sat down with it honestly and found something on the other side of that honesty that changed them. Not into someone unrecognizable, but into a clearer, quieter, more grounded version of who they already were. And that version, the one underneath all the noise and the armor and the years of running, was always the real one. Most people have an inner critic that has been operating unchecked for decades. It developed early, usually in childhood, usually in response to an environment where love felt conditional, where approval had to be earned, where making a mistake meant losing something important. And so the inner critic formed as a protection mechanism, a preemptive strike. If the person criticizes themselves first, harshly enough, completely enough, maybe the outside world will not need to. It was a survival strategy. And like most survival strategies, it outlived its usefulness by many years. Buddhism does not ask people to fight the inner critic. Fighting it gives it more power, the same way fighting the monkey mind makes it louder. What Buddhist practice asks instead is something more subtle and more effective. It asks for witnessing, to notice the inner critic speaking and to recognize it not as truth, but as a conditioned voice, a very old recording playing on a loop, not the actual self, just a pattern, just a habit that was learned so long ago it started to feel like identity. And the moment it is seen as a pattern rather than a truth, it begins to lose its authority. Here is something that sits uncomfortably for many people when they first encounter it. The harshest critics of themselves are very rarely the people who care the least. They are almost always the people who care the most, who wanted so badly to be good, to be enough, to be worthy, that they turned that wanting into a weapon and aimed it inward. And the cruel irony is that the very sensitivity that makes them capable of such deep self-criticism is the same sensitivity that makes them capable of extraordinary compassion. The same instrument, just pointed in the wrong direction. The Buddhist understanding of self-compassion is tied deeply to the concept of shared humanity. In Pali, this is part of what makes karuna different from simple kindness. It is compassion rooted in recognition. The recognition that suffering is not personal, that the pain of feeling inadequate, of making mistakes, of falling short of an imagined standard is not a unique flaw in one particular person. It is one of the most universal human experiences that has ever existed. Every person who has ever lived has felt it. And understanding this, truly understanding it rather than just intellectually agreeing with it, changes the weight of it entirely. There is a quiet but powerful shift that happens in a person when they stop treating their own suffering as evidence of failure and start treating it as evidence of being human. The suffering does not disappear, life does not suddenly become easy, but the layer of shame that was wrapped around the suffering, that extra weight of "this should not be happening to me, this means something is wrong with me," that layer begins to soften. And often it is that layer, not the suffering itself, that was making everything unbearable. Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said something simple that carried enormous weight for the people who heard it. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." Applied to self-compassion, this means something specific. The person who has decided they already know all their flaws, who has already concluded the verdict on their own worth, is closed. Nothing new can enter. But the person who approaches themselves with genuine curiosity, with the openness of someone who is still learning, still discovering, that person is alive in a way the other person is not. They are still becoming, and becoming is always more interesting than being finished. Being alone creates a specific and uncomfortable condition that most people do not have language for. When the external world is removed, the internal world fills the space. And for a person who has spent years being unkind to themselves internally, being alone means being trapped in a room with the harshest critic they know. This is why solitude feels unbearable to so many people, not because silence is the enemy, but because what fills the silence is relentless self-judgment. And learning self-compassion is not just good practice in general. For the person learning to be at peace alone, it is completely essential. The practice of metta, loving kindness toward the self, begins with a specific set of phrases repeated slowly and genuinely. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease. 4 simple sentences, and most people who try this for the first time feel deeply uncomfortable doing it. Something resists, a voice that says this is self-indulgent, a feeling of not quite deserving this kind of gentleness. And that resistance, that discomfort, that is not a sign that the practice is not working. That is the exact reason the practice exists, because the discomfort reveals precisely where the work needs to happen. Look at everything covered in this journey. The monkey mind that hijacks every quiet moment and turns it into chaos. The way the past and future steal the only moment that is actually real. The inner critic that has been operating unchecked for decades, turning every mistake into evidence of unworthiness. The difference between loneliness and solitude and why one destroys and the other restores. The daily practices, so simple they get dismissed, so ordinary they get overlooked, so available they require no special circumstance to begin. All of it pointing in the same direction, inward, always inward. Because that is where the actual life is. The most important thing Buddhism teaches about happiness is also the most uncomfortable. It teaches that happiness is not a destination, it is a direction. A person does not arrive at happiness and stay there. They choose it again and again in the small moments nobody else witnesses, in how they speak to themselves after a failure, in whether they return to the breath when the mind wanders, in whether they sit with the discomfort instead of immediately filling it, in whether they allow 5 minutes of genuine silence without feeling guilty about the productivity that silence is not producing. Each of these small choices is a vote, and the accumulated weight of enough small votes eventually determines the entire outcome. There is something worth saying about the world this video exists in. A world that is louder than it has ever been. A world that has weaponized attention and turned restlessness into an industry. A world that profits from the belief that people are not enough as they are, that something more is always needed, that the next thing, the next experience, the next version of the self will finally be the one that feels complete. Buddhism stands against all of this, not loudly, not angrily, but with the quiet confidence of something that has been tested by millions of lives across thousands of years and found to be true regardless of the century it was practiced in. Being alone is not a problem to be solved. It is a capacity to be developed. And like every genuine capacity, it grows only through use. The person who avoids solitude never develops a relationship with themselves. They outsource their sense of self to whoever is in the room. They rely on the mirror of other people to know who they are. And when the room empties, as it inevitably does, they find themselves strangers in their own company. But the person who practices solitude, who sits with themselves honestly and with increasing gentleness, that person builds something that cannot be taken away by circumstance, an inner companionship, a self that is familiar and trustworthy and genuinely good company. The Buddha's last words before he died were not complicated. They were not a final teaching packed with information. They were an instruction, a simple, clear, final instruction delivered to the monks gathered around him. He said, "Work out your salvation with diligence." That was it. Not believe these things, not follow these rules. Work it out, personally, honestly, with your own mind and your own life and your own willingness to sit with what is difficult until it becomes less difficult. Because the tradition always understood that no teacher can do this for anyone. The work has to be done from the inside, and the inside is exactly where this video has been trying to point all along. Something changes in a person when they stop treating silence as empty, when they stop treating alone time as time to survive rather than time to inhabit. It is not a dramatic change that happens all at once. It is a gradual softening, a loosening of the grip. The mornings start feeling different, not better because the circumstances changed, better because the relationship with the circumstances changed. The same ordinary life, the same imperfect relationships, the same unresolved problems, but met with a slightly different quality of presence. And that quality of presence, that thin but real difference between being half here and fully here, changes the entire experience of being alive. There is a particular kind of person who watches videos like this. Not someone looking for entertainment, not someone killing time, someone who felt something when the hook landed, someone who recognized something in the questions asked at the beginning, someone who has been living with a quiet and persistent feeling that there is another way to do this, another way to be in this life, a way that does not require constant noise and constant performance and constant management of how they appear to other people. If that description lands, this video was made for that person, and that person already knows more than they think. The knowing was always there, it just needed permission to be trusted.
Every single concept explored across these 8 parts has one practical application that requires no special equipment, no particular schedule, no teacher, and no ideal circumstances. It can be done tonight, after this video ends. When the screen goes dark and the room gets quiet, just sit for 5 minutes, not to achieve anything, not to perform mindfulness correctly, not to have a profound experience, just to be in the room with themselves without reaching for something to fill it. 5 minutes of choosing presence over noise. 5 minutes of letting the silence say whatever it needs to say. That is the entire practice distilled to its simplest possible form, and it is enough to start. Buddhism does not promise that this path is comfortable. That is one of the things that makes it trustworthy. It does not say that practicing presence and self-compassion and gratitude will make life easy. It says that it will make life real, and real includes difficult. Real includes grief and failure and moments of genuine darkness. But real also includes a quality of aliveness that the person running from all of this never gets to feel, a depth of experience, a richness in the ordinary, a capacity to be moved by small things and steadied by large things. And that combination, sensitivity without fragility, depth without drama, is what the tradition spent thousands of years trying to cultivate in the people who were willing to try. There is a reason this video ends in silence rather than answers, because that is where the actual work begins, not in the consuming of information, but in the space after the information ends, the space where a person is left alone with what they have heard and what it stirred and what it quietly suggested about the life they had been living and the life they might be capable of living instead.
That space, uncomfortable and fertile and completely personal, is not empty. It is full of exactly what each person needs to find, and no video, no book, no teacher can go in there with them. That particular journey is always taken alone. There is one more thing worth saying before this ends about the word alone itself, because it has appeared hundreds of times in this video and it has been carrying a specific weight, a weight that hopefully shifted somewhere in the course of these 8 parts. Alone does not have to mean abandoned. It does not have to mean unwanted or insufficient or incomplete. In the Buddhist understanding, being alone at its deepest level means being whole. One, not fragmented across past regrets and future anxieties, not scattered across other people's opinions and expectations, but gathered, present, here. And a person who is gathered and present and here is not alone in the way that hurts. They are alone in the way that heals. The ancient monasteries were not built in remote mountains because the monks were antisocial. They were built there because the people who built them understood something about human nature that urban life conveniently forgets. That the noise of the world is not neutral. It is not just background. It actively shapes the mind. It pulls attention outward constantly. It creates the illusion that the important things are always happening somewhere else. And the physical distance of the monastery was not about running away from life. It was about creating enough space from the noise to finally hear what was true. And the remarkable discovery, repeated across cultures and centuries, was that what was true was always quiet. It never shouted. It waited patiently for the noise to stop. If there is one practice to carry forward from everything in this video, one thing to actually do rather than simply know, let it be this. Once a day, for just a few minutes, put everything down. Not as a technique, not as a task on a list, but as an act of respect for the part of the self that never gets any quiet. The part that has been buried under decades of noise and busyness and performance. Give it a few minutes. Sit with it. Listen to it. Not to solve anything or fix anything or produce anything from the experience, just to acknowledge that it exists, that it matters, that it has something to say. Because it does. It has always had something to say. It was just never given the silence to say it in.
Now, this is the part where most videos ask the viewer to like and subscribe. And this video is going to ask that too, but with a reason that is actually worth the ask. Wisdom Woven exists to put this kind of content in front of people who need it, not people who are looking for entertainment. People who are genuinely searching for something real. And every like, every comment, every subscription tells the algorithm that this kind of content deserves to reach further. So if something in this video landed, if something here felt true or useful or like something that needed to be heard, like this video. Subscribe to Wisdom Woven. Share this with one person who is carrying something heavy right now, because that one share might be exactly what reaches them tonight when they are sitting alone wondering if anyone else feels what they feel. And the answer is yes. Always yes. Leave a comment below this video, not because comments help the channel, though they do, but because writing what landed, even just one sentence, even just one word, is a way of making it real, of moving it from the screen into the life, of beginning the practice of honest self-reflection right now, in this moment, before the next distraction arrives. The comment section of this video is full of people who watched the same thing and felt something similar. And reading those comments, knowing others are on the same path, is its own quiet form of the connection that does not require noise to be genuine. Everything changes when a person stops waiting to feel ready. Readiness is not a feeling that arrives before the practice begins. It is a feeling that slowly develops because the practice was begun without it. Nobody sits down in meditation for the first time and feels peaceful. Nobody chooses solitude for the first time and immediately feels whole. The discomfort comes first, always. And moving through that discomfort, not avoiding it, not fixing it, just moving through it with honesty and a little gentleness, that is where every version of real change has always begun. Not in the comfortable moments, in the ones that required something. So here is the question to sit with tonight, the one that does not have a clean answer, the one that is worth more than any answer this video could have given. If the noise were gone, if the distractions disappeared, if the room went completely quiet right now and stayed that way, what would be left? Not what should be left, not what a person hopes would be left. What is actually there, underneath everything, in the deepest and most honest part of the self that nobody else ever sees? Because whatever is there, whether it is peace or chaos or grief or something that has never had a name, that is the starting point. That is the actual beginning of the only journey that has ever mattered. And it starts not tomorrow, not when life is simpler, not when everything is resolved. It starts in the silence, right now, tonight, in this exact moment, which was always, always enough.